Welcome back to the briefing. There are two numbers that define what is actually happening in the global energy markets right now, and the gap between them is not a supply chain disruption or a temporary bottleneck. It is the structural collapse of the calculation that kept the world economy functioning for the past 2 decades. Number one, 20%. That is the percentage of global LNG production that just went offline when Qatar's largest facility entered cold standby mode due to escalating security risks. Number two, 30 days. That is the minimum time required to bring that facility back to full capacity, even if the order to restart operations is given today. 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas supply vanished in a security decision, and the markets that depend on it, Europe cutting Russian gas, East Asia with zero alternatives, are staring at a supply gap that cannot be filled by any other source at any price in the time frame that matters. Stay with me, because the second set of numbers is worse. Iraq's daily oil production capacity, 4.0 million barrels. Iraq's current daily oil production, 0. The Basra Gulf has been closed for 5 days. Tankers cannot enter. Storage facilities are full. And the wells that took 20 years of infrastructure investment to build are now shut down, not because they were damaged, but because there is nowhere to send the oil. 2 million barrels per day of production halted. And here is what every energy analyst is whispering, but no official statement will confirm. Restarting those wells and returning to previous production levels could take months, possibly years, even though no physical damage occurred. The shutdown itself is the damage. Reservoir pressure, well integrity, infrastructure sequencing. This is not flipping a switch. This is geological and mechanical recalibration at a scale that has no modern precedent in the Gulf. But here's the detail everyone missed while watching missile strikes and air defense intercepts. The reason Qatar's LNG facility went into cold standby was not a direct hit. It was a risk calculation. The same calculation that shipping insurers made when they pulled coverage for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The same calculation that Maersk made when it suspended all operations through both Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb simultaneously. The calculation is this: the cost of operating in a theater where 12 countries are now being targeted, where command and control is fragmented, where retaliation is no longer centrally coordinated, is higher than the cost of shutting down and waiting for conditions that may never return to baseline. That is not a tactical decision. That is a structural reassessment of whether the energy infrastructure that powers Asia and Europe can function in a Middle East where the distinction between military and economic targets has completely dissolved. Now consider what happened to decision-making inside Iran after the decapitation strike. The supreme leader is dead. 40 senior commanders eliminated in coordinated precision strikes. And instead of a constitutional succession process producing a new political leadership, the entire governing apparatus defaulted to the IRGC, a paramilitary organization designed for asymmetric warfare, not statecraft. Political calculations, diplomatic channels, strategic restraint, all of it evaporated the moment decision-making authority transferred to commanders whose training, whose institutional culture, whose entire operational framework is built around retaliation, not negotiation. The result is not a coordinated military strategy. It is a spasm. Targets expanding from Israel to Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, Turkey, Azerbaijan. 12 countries. Not because there is a strategic logic to broadening the conflict, but because there is no centralized authority left to impose restraint. And here is where the United States made its move. With no clear successor and the IRGC running operations without political oversight, Washington stepped directly into Iran's succession process. The son of the fallen leader attempting to consolidate power? Unacceptable. The U.S. declared it publicly. This is Venezuela-style regime management, not regime change through internal revolution, but regime selection through external veto. America is now openly determining which Iranian leaders are permissible while prosecuting the largest air campaign in the region since 2003. That is not deterrence. That is occupation-level intervention without ground troops. And every regional power is watching this precedent. If Washington can veto Iran's succession while bombing its infrastructure, what prevents the same mechanism from being applied to any government in the region that makes decisions contrary to American interests? The Gulf states are taking notes. Turkey is taking notes. Every capital from Cairo to Islamabad is recalculating what sovereignty actually means. But the operational tempo reveals something more disturbing. New IRGC commanders are being appointed and eliminated within hours, not days, hours. The intelligence cycle that allowed Israel and the U.S. to track and kill the supreme leader in a fortified compound with 40 senior officials present is now operating in real time against mid-level field commanders. Every replacement is identified, geolocated, and struck before they can establish command authority. This is not battlefield attrition. This is algorithmic targeting. The intelligence fusion between Israeli and American systems has reached a level where the appointment of a new missile battery commander is detected and prosecuted faster than that commander can receive his operational briefing. That creates a cascading collapse in command coherence. Units in the field are operating without central coordination because no one survives long enough in the command chain to issue coordinated orders. Israel's air operations reflect this intelligence advantage. 90 aircraft, 40 targets one morning, then follow-on waves. Then the first air-to-air engagement since the 1980s, when an F-35 splashed an Iranian jet. Simultaneously, ground forces advancing into southern Lebanon, evacuation orders for strategic neighborhoods south of Beirut, and sustained bombardment of infrastructure that has nothing to do with Hezbollah's military capacity and everything to do with reshaping the political geography of Lebanon before any ceasefire can freeze positions. This is not a counterterrorism operation. This is territorial restructuring under the cover of a regional war. Now here is the cost asymmetry that no amount of American firepower can solve. Iran produces in 1 week the same number of Shahed drones that the United States produces PAC-3 interceptor missiles in 1 year. Let that sink in for a moment. A Shahed costs less than $20,000 to manufacture. A PAC-3 interceptor costs over $1 million. Iran's weekly drone production equals America's annual high-end interceptor production. And the drones do not need to survive. They just need to force the defender to expend million-dollar missiles on $1,000 threats until the defender's magazine is empty. That math does not work. It has never worked. And it is why, despite Israel and the U.S. destroying 60 to 80% of Iran's ballistic missile and drone launch capacity attacks, are continuing at an intensity that suggests the remaining 20 to 40% is sufficient to sustain operations indefinitely. Which brings us to the solution that desperation produces. Britain is coordinating the transfer of Ukrainian military teams to the United Arab Emirates. Not advisors. Operational units with 4 years of combat experience defending against the exact drone threat that is now overwhelming Gulf air defenses. The Ukrainians developed anti-drone systems that cost $2,000 to $3,000. Acoustic sensors, rapid-fire targeting, low-tech solutions for high-volume threats. They work on land in Eastern Europe. Whether they work over water in the Basra Gulf is the experiment that is about to be conducted in real time with the economic infrastructure of the Gulf states as the test environment. If the technology transfers successfully, it represents the first viable counter to the cost asymmetry problem. If it does not, then the Gulf air defense architecture, hundreds of billions of dollars in Patriot batteries and THAAD systems, remains vulnerable to saturation attacks by weapons that cost less than a used car. But technology transfer cannot solve the intelligence problem. Israel's military intelligence hacked Iranian state television networks and is broadcasting directly to Iranian civilians and military personnel. Psychological warfare at scale. Messages encouraging defection, uprising, abandonment of posts. This is not propaganda. This is operational information warfare designed to collapse unit cohesion before kinetic strikes arrive. The broadcasts are timed to coincide with strikes on specific units, creating the perception among Iranian forces that their communications are compromised and their commanders cannot protect them. That perception produces the same operational effect as actual intelligence: hesitation, fragmentation, and breakdown of command trust. And it is being coordinated with a ground effort to arm Kurdish groups inside Iran and Iraq. The plan is straightforward. Create an internal insurgency that forces the IRGC to divert resources from external operations to internal security. The problem is execution. The Kurdish groups remember being abandoned by the United States in Syria, watching Turkish forces move into positions American troops had just vacated. That institutional memory makes recruitment difficult. They lack equipment. And the logistics routes are blocked because Turkey and Iraq both have their own internal security concerns about arming Kurdish militias. Turkey views any armed Kurdish force as an existential threat. Iraq's government, dependent on both Iranian and American support simultaneously, cannot facilitate an insurgency against its neighbor. So the insurgency plan exists on paper, has CIA officers assigned, but cannot be implemented, because the regional infrastructure required does not exist and cannot be created without alienating allies that host American bases. Which means the internal pressure strategy remains limited to television hacking and leaflet drops, while the IRGC continues attacking external targets without meaningful internal distraction. Here is what all of this adds up to in terms that matter to anyone not holding a defense contractor stock portfolio. The energy infrastructure that supplies Europe and Asia is offline, not damaged, offline by decision. Qatar's LNG facility can be restarted, but it will not be restarted until security conditions stabilize. And security conditions will not stabilize because there is no political authority in Iran capable of negotiating a ceasefire that the IRGC will respect. Iraq's oil production can be restarted, but the Basra Gulf will not reopen until the drone and missile threat is neutralized. And the drone threat cannot be neutralized because the cost to defend is 10 times the cost to attack, and the defender's magazines are finite. Shipping insurers have pulled coverage. Maersk has suspended operations through both critical choke points simultaneously. That means any vessel transiting from the Gulf to Europe or Asia must go around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days in costs that will appear in every price of every product. And the markets are starting to price this in. Brent crude heading toward $120 per barrel. Gold up, Dow futures down, European stock markets in free fall. Not because of a single missile strike, but because the calculation that energy will flow, that choke points will remain open, that infrastructure will be protected, that calculation is breaking. 20% of global LNG offline, 2 million barrels per day of oil production halted. The two most critical maritime corridors on Earth suspended simultaneously. That is not a temporary disruption. That is a structural shift in how energy reaches the economies that need it. The United States is now directly selecting Iran's next leader, while prosecuting an air campaign that has destroyed the majority of Iran's strategic launch capacity, but cannot prevent the remaining capacity from sustaining attacks, because the cost asymmetry is unsolvable with current technology. Israel is reshaping Lebanon's political geography, under cover of the regional war, while conducting air operations inside Iran at a tempo that requires real-time intelligence fusion that no other military on Earth can replicate. And the solution to the drone saturation problem is Ukrainian combat engineers testing low-cost systems over Gulf waters with zero guarantee of success. This is not a war that ends with a ceasefire negotiated by diplomats in Geneva. This is a war that ends when one side's capacity to sustain operations collapses. And right now, the side with the technological advantage, the intelligence dominance, and the precision strike capability is spending itself into economic exhaustion, defending against threats that cost 1% of the interceptor price. While the side that lost its political leadership, 60 to 80% of its launch capacity, and 40 senior commanders in coordinated strikes, is still attacking 12 countries simultaneously because the decision-making authority transferred to an organization that does not calculate cost-only retaliation. So here's the question no one in Washington or Tel Aviv wants to answer publicly. What happens when the defender runs out of interceptors before the attacker runs out of drones? What happens when the Gulf states conclude that American protection costs more than it delivers and start making their own arrangements? What happens when 20% of global LNG stays offline not for weeks, but for months? Because no security guarantee exists that makes restarting operations economically rational? The energy markets are not waiting for those answers. They are pricing in the reality that the Middle East's economic infrastructure is now a legitimate target in a conflict where command and control has fragmented, where retaliation is decentralized, and where the cost to attack is always lower than the cost to defend. The calculation that kept global energy flowing, the assumption that economic targets would remain off limits, that calculation is dead. Share this analysis because the gap between what officials are saying and what the data shows is not a communications problem. It is the gap between a world where energy flows because agreements hold and a world where energy stops because the math of asymmetric warfare makes defense unsustainable.